Discover the surprising story of German prisoners of war held in America who were served hamburgers but believed they were being given a final meal before execution. In this fascinating video, learn how a simple misunderstanding revealed the deep cultural divide between captors and captives. 1944, United States of America. Thousands of miles from the battlefields of Europe, another side of the war was unfolding. One without artillery, without trenches, and without front lines. It was a war of barbed wire, guard towers, and long waiting. Across the United States, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were being held in camps scattered from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of New England. Most Americans barely knew they were there. The camps were often tucked away in rural areas, built on farmland or near small towns, where life still moved at a peaceful, almost ordinary pace. For the men inside the fences, though nothing felt ordinary, they had been captured in North Africa, in Italy, in France. Some had surrendered after fierce battles. Others had simply found themselves surrounded when their units collapsed. Many had expected imprisonment to be brutal, revenge for the bombed cities, the dead soldiers, the years of bloodshed. Instead, they arrived in a country that followed a different set of rules. The United States, determined that its own captured soldiers be treated well overseas, strictly followed the 1929 Geneva Convention. That meant German POWs received shelter, medical care, and food rations comparable to American troops. To men who had grown used to shortages back home, the portions alone felt unreal. But nothing confused them more than the day they were served hamburgers. It happened in a camp in the American Midwest, not long after a new group of prisoners arrived from Europe. They were thin, tired, and weary. Young men who had spent years in uniform and months on transport ships. Unsure what kind of captivity awaited them, they were marched into the mess hall in orderly rows, boots scuffing on the wooden floor. Guards stood along the walls, relaxed but watchful. The air smelled strange, not like cabbage soup or dark bread, not like the thin stews they had known near the end of the war. This smell was rich, greasy, almost sweet. They shuffled forward with metal trays, eyes scanning the serving line. Then they saw it, a round piece of bread, soft, pale, sliced cleanly in half. Inside it, a thick patty of ground meat. On top, something red and glossy, a slice of pale cheese melting over the edges. They froze. Some stared, some frowned. A few glanced nervously at one another. In Germany, especially in rural areas and among older traditions, certain foods were closely tied to specific occasions. Rich meat dishes, white bread, carefully prepared meals. These were not everyday fare in wartime. They were associated with Sundays, holidays, and funerals. Back home, after a burial, families would gather for a special meal. It was one of the few times scarce ingredients might be used generously, a final gesture of honor for the dead. To the exhausted POWs standing in line, this unfamiliar American sandwich looked like ceremony food. One man whispered, "Where ist gestorben?" Who has died? Another murmured that perhaps this was a last meal before punishment, a dark joke, half serious. After all, they had been told by propaganda for years that Americans were cruel, that captivity might mean humiliation or worse. Why else would they be given such rich food? The guards, noticing the hesitation, tried to wave them forward. "Take it," one of the cooks said, smiling, unaware of the confusion. Plenty more. The prisoners accepted the hamburgers cautiously, carrying their trays to long wooden tables. They sat stiffly, back straight, as if waiting for an announcement. No one ate. Instead, they studied the strange sandwich. One man lifted the top bun and sniffed it. Another poked the meat with a fork. Someone else touched the ketchup and pulled his finger back, examining the bright red sauce, as if it might stain. Finally, a younger prisoner, hungry enough to override suspicion, took a bite. He chewed slowly. His eyes widened. "It's good," he said, surprised. Across the table, another took a tentative bite. Then another. Within minutes, The silence gave way to the unmistakable sounds of men eating with real appetite. Hunger overcame ceremony. Suspicion melted under the simple power of hot food and full stomachs. When a guard walked by and asked, "You boys like burgers?" most of them didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. This wasn't a funeral meal. It was just lunch. Moments like that quietly reshaped how many German POWs saw their captivity. They still missed home. They still worried about their families under bombing raids. They still didn't know what would happen to Germany or to themselves when the war ended. But the reality inside American POW camps often clashed sharply with the image they had been fed for years. They worked on farms, harvesting crops that fed the very country they had once been told to hate. They repaired roads, cut timber, packed food in canneries. For their labor, they were paid small wages in camp scrip, which they could spend at canteens on soap, extra food, or even musical instruments. Some camps organized soccer leagues, others had libraries. In certain places, local civilians, at first wary, slowly began to see the prisoners, not as monsters, but as young men caught in a war started by leaders far above them. And sometimes, cultural misunderstandings led to moments of awkward, almost human comedy, like a group of German soldiers mistaking an American hamburger for a funeral tradition. Years later, former POWs would remember their time in the United States with a mix of emotions: shame at having served a regime responsible for immense suffering, relief at having survived, gratitude for unexpected decency from former enemies. A few even returned to America after the war as immigrants, drawn back to the farms and towns where they had once lived behind fences. As for the hamburger, that simple, everyday American food, it became, for some of them, a symbol, not of defeat, not of victory, but of the strange moment when the war's black and white certainties blurred, and an enemy handed you a warm meal instead of a blow. History often focuses on the violence, the battles, the destruction, the hatred, but sometimes the smallest details, a shared task in a field, a game of soccer behind barbed wire, a confusing sandwich in a mess hall, reveal something just as important. Even in war, humanity has a way of slipping through the cracks, and sometimes it arrives on a tray between two slices of bread. For many of those men, that first strange meal was only the beginning of a slow, uncomfortable education. Not about weapons, not about tactics, but about the world beyond the one they had been taught to believe in. Inside the camps, routine settled in with surprising speed. Mornings began with roll call, the clatter of boots on packed dirt, the counting and recounting of faces under the watch of American guards. After breakfast, work details marched out under supervision to nearby farms, lumber yards, road crews. The farmers who received them were often short on labor. With so many American men overseas, crops still had to be planted and harvested. At first, the locals watched the prisoners closely. These were enemy soldiers, after all, men who had worn the same uniform as those fighting their sons and brothers across the ocean. But day after day, suspicion met reality. The prisoners worked hard. They followed instructions. Many were farm boys themselves, more familiar with plows than rifles. Shared labor created a strange, quiet bridge. A nod of thanks, a canteen of water passed over, a cigarette offered at the edge of a field. Conversations came slowly, broken English and broken German, stitched together with gestures. "Family?" a farmer might ask, pointing to a photograph in his wallet. The prisoner would nod, pull out a worn picture of his own, a mother, a sister, a fiancée, standing in front of a house that might no longer be standing. In those moments, the war felt both very close and impossibly far away. Back in the camps, education programs began to appear. The US authorities, thinking ahead to a post-war world, allowed and even encouraged classes. Some were practical, English lessons, mathematics, trades. Others were more subtle. Newspapers were distributed, sometimes with certain sections translated, Films were shown. Information about the broader course of the war filtered in, challenging the propaganda many prisoners had grown up with. Not all of them accepted it easily. Hardcore Nazis within the camps tried to maintain control, intimidating or even attacking fellow prisoners they suspected of being disloyal. In some camps, pro-Nazi groups held secret courts, punishing those who spoke too openly or questioned the regime. American authorities responded by separating the most fanatical prisoners from the rest, creating special compounds to reduce their influence. Slowly, for many of the younger or less ideological soldiers, the grip of fear began to loosen. They started to talk more freely. They asked questions. They listened. And always there was the food, steady, filling, sometimes bewildering. Powdered eggs, peanut butter, sweet corn, coffee that tasted different from what they knew, white bread that seemed impossibly soft compared to the dark, dense loaves of home. Meals became markers of time. Thanksgiving turkeys, Christmas dinners with extra portions, not lavish, but thoughtful. Signs that, at least here, they were seen as human beings under guard, not animals to be broken. Letters from home were censored, but allowed. Weeks or months late, they still carried enormous weight. News of bombed cities, missing relatives, the advance of Soviet forces from the east, the growing certainty that Germany was losing. In April 1945, the news finally arrived in full. Hitler was dead. Berlin was falling. The war in Europe was ending. For the German POWs in America, the announcement brought not celebration, but a heavy, complicated silence. Relief that the killing might stop. Fear of what awaited their families in a shattered country. Uncertainty about their own fate. Would they be sent home? Kept for labor? Handed over to other Allied powers? In the mess halls and barracks, conversations stretched late into the night. Some men wept quietly. Others stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine a Germany that no longer had the symbols and slogans that had defined their youth. Through it all, the daily routines continued. Roll call, work, meals. One former prisoner would later recall sitting at a wooden table in an American camp in the summer of 1945, holding a hamburger in his hands again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He understood now. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't a trick. It was simply part of life, in a country that, despite everything, had chosen to follow rules even in war. Years later, when many of these men were finally repatriated, they returned to ruins, cities flattened, industries destroyed, families scattered. Some carried with them small, ordinary memories from captivity in America. The taste of oranges, for the first time in years, the sound of jazz on the camp radio, the sight of wide-open fields that hadn't been shelled into craters. And yes, the memory of that first confusing sandwich. History is full of grand strategies and famous generals, but the experience of war is often shaped by quieter moments, by how people are treated when they are powerless, by whether rules are kept when hatred would be easier. For thousands of German POWs, America was not the place they had been warned about. It was not perfect. It was still a prison, but it was also a place where an enemy could be handed a meal, given medical care, allowed to write home, and slowly begin to see the other side as human. Sometimes, the distance between enemies isn't closed by speeches or treaties. Sometimes, it's closed by a farmer sharing a day's work, a guard choosing patience, or a confused young soldier taking a bite of a hamburger and realizing the world is more complicated than he had ever been told. Over time, those small realizations began to stack up. Not all at once, not in dramatic speeches or sudden conversions, but in quiet shifts, the kind that happen when daily life contradicts everything you were taught to fear. Some prisoners were transferred between camps as labor needs changed. They saw different parts of America, pine forests in the south, wide farmland in the Midwest, dusty roads near small railroad towns, always under guard, always behind fences at night. But still, more of the country than many American civilians themselves had ever seen. On work details, they repaired fences, picked cotton, harvested sugar beets, cut timber. The work was hard, but it was work they understood. Blisters, sore backs, sunburn, familiar complaints from a world before uniforms and artillery. Farm families sometimes left out extra food or cold water without making a show of it. A slice of pie on a fence post, a jar of lemonade in the shade. Technically, fraternization was restricted, but humanity has a way of slipping through the cracks of regulations. A guard might look the other way for a moment. A farmer's child might wave shyly from a porch, and a prisoner, who only months earlier had been told Americans were monsters, would wave back. Inside the camps, cultural programs expanded. Libraries formed from donated books. Music groups appeared. Violins fashioned from scrap wood. Accordions somehow acquired. Voices raised in old folk songs that floated over the barbed wire at dusk. American officers sometimes encouraged discussions about politics and history, carefully, deliberately. They weren't trying to humiliate the prisoners. They were trying to expose them to other ways of thinking. Some prisoners resisted, clinging to old beliefs. Others listened in silence, their certainty eroding piece by piece. The turning point for many came not from lectures, but from newsreels. Footage from liberated concentration camps began to circulate in 1945. The images were almost impossible to process. Skeletal survivors, mass graves, the scale of suffering laid bare. Some prisoners insisted it was enemy propaganda. Others couldn't look away. In barracks that night, arguments broke out in hushed, urgent tones. If this is true, it can't be. But what if it is? For young soldiers especially, boys who had grown up inside a tightly controlled system of information, the shock was profound. The war, they had been told, was noble, defensive, necessary, suddenly looked very different. Guilt mixed with disbelief, shame tangled with grief. And through all of it, the strange reality remained. They were being fed, housed, and protected by the very people they had been taught to hate. By late 1945 and into 1946, repatriation began in waves. Not all at once. Shipping space was limited. Europe's infrastructure was shattered. Some prisoners would spend years in captivity, though the fighting had ended. When departure orders finally came, emotions were complicated. Men lined up with small bundles of belongings, letters, handmade crafts, maybe a book in English they had learned to read. Some had addresses scribbled on scraps of paper, American farmers, guards, or families they had met, promising to write someday. At train stations near the camps, local civilians sometimes gathered to watch the columns march past one last time. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just quiet observation. A few hands lifted in brief waves. Some prisoners waved back. The ships that carried them home crossed an ocean that now felt wider than ever. They were going back to a defeated nation, to hunger, to ruins, to questions no one could easily answer. Yet many carried with them memories that didn't fit the simple story of enemies and allies. They remembered guards who treated them firmly but fairly, doctors who set broken bones without asking about politics, farmers who trusted them with tools sharp enough to be weapons and were not betrayed. And always in small, almost absurd detail, they remembered the food, the first taste of peanut butter, the shock of sweet soda, and that first hamburger they had once mistaken for something sinister, only to later understand it was just an ordinary meal in an ordinary life that had continued, somehow, while the world burned. Years later, some former POWs would return to America, not as prisoners, but as visitors, immigrants, business partners. A few tracked down the farms where they had once worked, now run by the children or grandchildren of the people who had known them as enemy soldiers. They stood in those fields as old men, remembering being young and afraid, half-starved on propaganda and fear, certain they would be brutalized, and instead being handed a sandwich and told where to stack the hay. War had brought them there, but simple, everyday decency had left the deeper mark. History often focuses on the battles that destroy. Less often, it remembers the quiet choices that rebuild. Not cities or governments, but the fragile idea that even enemies are still human. In barbed wire camps scattered across America, that idea survived the war. Not in speeches, not in treaties, but in shared work, guarded kindness, and one very confusing hamburger that turned out to be nothing more and nothing less than a meal offered by one human being to another. Decades later, when those former prisoners told their grandchildren about the war, the stories often surprised their listeners. Yes, there were battles, fear, the long marches into captivity, but then the tone would shift. They would talk about endless American skies over farm fields, about learning English words from a farmer's daughter who left a dictionary on a fence post, about baseball games they didn't fully understand but cheered for anyway, about music drifting from a radio in a guard shack on warm summer nights. And inevitably, someone would laugh softly and mention the food. The first time they gave us hamburgers, one former POW recalled in an interview years later, we thought someone must have died. Back home, meat like that meant a special occasion. We were suspicious. We didn't trust it. He shook his head, smiling at the memory. Turns out it was just Tuesday. That small misunderstanding became a symbol, in hindsight, of how far apart cultures can seem in wartime, and how quickly fear fills the gaps where knowledge should be. For many of those men, captivity in America didn't erase what they had been part of. It didn't undo the damage done by the regime they had served, but it complicated the story. They had seen an enemy nation strong enough to win, and still restrained enough to follow rules. They had experienced a form of power that didn't always need cruelty to prove itself. That left an impression. Back in post-war Germany, as the country struggled to rebuild both its cities and its conscience, some former POWs drew on those memories. They spoke up when old extremist ideas tried to resurface. They supported new democratic institutions, remembering that they had once lived, however briefly, inside a society where disagreement didn't automatically mean prison or worse. Not all of them changed, not all of them reflected deeply, but enough did that those quiet years behind barbed wire in a distant land became part of a larger, slow transformation. History rarely turns on a single meal, but history is shaped by millions of small human experiences, moments when expectations are broken, when enemies don't behave like monsters, when the world proves more complex than propaganda ever allowed. In the grand story of World War II, POW camps in America are a footnote. Yet inside those fences, something unusual happened. Hatred, carefully cultivated for years, was forced to share space with everyday decency. And sometimes, decency won. Not in headlines, not in parades, but in the memory of a confused young soldier sitting at a long wooden table, staring at a hamburger he didn't understand, and slowly realizing that the people across the ocean were not the caricatures he had been taught to fear. In the end, that realization mattered, because wars eventually end. Borders shift, armies disband, but the way people are treated when they are powerless, that lingers. In letters saved in drawers, in stories told to grandchildren, in the quiet hope that, if the world ever falls into darkness again, someone, somewhere, will still choose to offer a meal instead of a blow. Years after the war, reunions began to happen in the most unexpected ways. A letter would arrive from overseas, written in careful English. A photograph, yellowed at the edges, would be tucked inside. A group of young men in worn uniforms, standing beside an American farmer, all of them squinting into the same bright sun. On the back, a date, a place, sometimes just one word: friends. In small towns across the United States, former guards and local families would occasionally receive these letters. The senders were older now, grandfathers, shopkeepers, mechanics, men who had once worn the uniform of a regime that brought the world to ruin and who had later stood in dusty American fields, learning how to mend fences and milk cows under watchtowers and guard patrols. They didn't write to justify the war. They didn't try to excuse the cause they had served. Most of the time, they wrote about something simpler: kindness they had not expected. One former POW described the first Christmas he spent in captivity. He and the others had braced themselves for a hard day, certain it would be ignored or treated like any other. Instead, they were given a slightly better meal, a few extra blankets. Someone had even found a small pine branch and placed it in the barracks, decorated with scraps of colored paper. It was not much, he wrote decades later, but it told us we were still human. For the Americans running those camps, life went on with a strange duality. They were at war, reading casualty lists in newspapers, worrying about sons and brothers fighting overseas, while also overseeing men who, just months earlier, might have been shooting at those same loved ones. Resentment was natural. Grief was real. And yet, rules were followed, not perfectly, not without exceptions, but often enough to make a difference. Guards enforced discipline, but many also talked with the prisoners. They exchanged language lessons, debated farming techniques, argued about which country had the better bread. Some of those conversations were awkward, some were tense, but others slowly chipped away at the wall of propaganda both sides had grown up with. The prisoners learned that Americans were not universally wealthy movie stars or brutal gangsters, as some had been told. The Americans learned that not every German soldier was a fanatical believer. Many were tired, frightened young men, pulled into something far bigger than themselves. None of this erased responsibility, but it added layers to a story that had once seemed simple. By the late 1940s, as former POWs stepped onto ships bound for Europe, many carried mixed emotions. Relief to be going home, anxiety about what home even meant now, and, unexpectedly, a quiet gratitude toward a land that had held them captive, yet also shown them a different way a powerful nation could behave. Some would later help rebuild German towns using construction skills first practiced on American farms. Others would become teachers, passing on not just language skills learned in camp, but also memories of a society where ordinary people could disagree with their leaders without disappearing in the night. A few even returned to visit. They stood at the edges of old campsites, now empty fields, shopping centers, or quiet stretches of countryside, and tried to explain to their children that this was where everything they thought they knew had started to change. This, one man said, pointing to an overgrown patch of land in the American South, is where I first realized the war was not what we were told, all because of a meal that made no sense to him at the time. A hamburger on a metal tray. Hot, plain, ordinary, and offered without hatred. In the vast machinery of World War II, it was a tiny moment, easy to overlook, impossible to measure. But for some of the men who lived it, that moment became a crack in the story they had been given, a small opening where a different understanding of the world could begin. And sometimes, history changes not only through battles and treaties, but through simple acts that remind people, even in the aftermath of unimaginable violence, that humanity can survive on both sides of the wire. If this story surprised you, you're not alone. History is full of moments they never taught us in school. Drop a comment below and tell us what shocked you most about this story. We read them all, and your thoughts help shape the next videos. And if you want more powerful, untold stories from World War II, the human moments, the unexpected kindness, and the unbelievable true events, make sure you subscribe to WW2 Studio and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. History isn't just about battles, it's about people. See you in the next story.